Good evening. Welcome back to the MWP Lectures. Today we are very happy to have with us Aaron Reeves from London School of Economics, who's going to be talking about his recent research on the British elite. And I'll turn the floor to Mary-Lou, who is a Max Weber Fellow with us, who's going to be introducing the speaker. Please.
So it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Aaron Reeves for the second Max Weber Lecture of the year. Professor Reeves is currently a professor of sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is also affiliated with the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford and the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. His research offers a rich exploration of social inequality spanning the political economy of health, policymaking and welfare reforms, and the formation of elites in Britain. His scholarship is reflected in two major books. His first, published in 2021, addresses the public health challenges of aging. It debunks common myths about its economic and health consequences while advocating for policies that promote fairness across generations. The second book, which is the focus of today's talk, delves into the evolution of British elites over the past 150 years. Beyond these books, Professor Reeves has published over 80 articles in leading academic journals, including the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, British Medical Journal, and the Socio-Economic Review. He also serves as co-editor of the British Journal of Sociology. His work has earned recognition through numerous awards, including Best Article prizes, and he has successfully secured substantial research funding, such as the ERC starting grant we all dream of, to advance his research on elites. Importantly, his influence extends beyond academia. He has served as an expert for major international organizations, including the World Health Organization, and actively engages in sharing academic findings in public and media arenas. Today, Aaron Reeves will present Born to Rule, the Making and Remaking of the British Elite, a book he co-authored with Sam Friedman. This work traces the evolution of the top British elites from the Victorian era to the present by asking the question of how they are made, or how they think, and how they exercise power. This is a study that will captivate us as Max Weber Fellows from diverse disciplines for many reasons. It weaves together insights from multiple disciplines and takes intersectionality seriously. It moves from the micro, an individual's musical tastes, to the macro, a public policy. It also makes an exceptionally original use of the different methods available to social scientists, from interviews to experiments. But beyond mapping the British elites, this book is ultimately about the power of stories and narratives in our societies, making it a perfect follow-up to Michel Lamont's talk. Having read this book with great interest, we are excited to engage with its arguments at what appears to be a very timely moment to discuss elites and their political power. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Reeves as he shares more on his work.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly kind and generous, and I feel humbled to be part of this moment and opportunity, especially because I'm following up Michel Lamont. That to me is incredibly intimidating. I feel very grateful for the invitation to Claudia, to Juho, to Mary-Lou and Camille for kind of helping me both get here and navigate being part of this session. And I think it's absolutely right that the kinds of questions that we're trying to address feel very present and prescient, both in the British context, but also I think in other places too. And I would be fascinated to hear whether the kinds of arguments that we're making in this book resonate with the kinds of contexts that you know well and possibly much better than I do. So first of all, I'm mindful that I'm a stander when I talk, but I also really like to move. And so I want to, I hope that people can hear me at the back, that the mic's hitting okay. But if it ever stops, just kind of raise your hands in the middle. I'll try and make sure that I come closer. I want to start today with a very British phrase, complete rubbish. For nearly 2 hours, Henry, a retired corporate lawyer who had worked in the city, had talked amiably about his career. But suddenly, the mood had changed. We had asked him a question that we'd asked around 150 of the people that we spoke to for this book. We asked, do you consider yourself to be a member of the British elite? Henry was visibly offended. But yet there was something, to us at least, incongruous about his outrage. Maybe it was the fact that we were conducting that interview in his 7-bedroom townhouse in Bloomsbury, an exclusive part of central London. Maybe it was the fact that his wealth extended beyond £10 million. Maybe it was the fact that a self-portrait hung prominently in the wall as we conducted the interview. But maybe it was something about his background and life trajectory. His father was a senior civil servant. His grandfather was as well. He'd attended one of Britain's most prestigious public schools and then gone on to Oxford before having a 30-year career in a Magic Circle law firm as a senior partner. Maybe it was the fact that despite his protestations, Henry, as it became apparent during the interview, was extremely influential. He counted as friends a governor of the Bank of England. He knew a former chancellor of the Exchequer and had used his position at key moments in his career to try and leverage and influence policymakers in Britain. So to us, at least, Henry was the very embodiment of the British elite, both in origin and in destination. And yet, it was very clear as the interview went on that for people like Henry, and in fact, many of the people that we spoke to for this book, they do not see themselves in that way at all. He resisted the idea that his privilege had helped his career in any meaningful way. He played up his working class ancestors and downplayed his influence and argued that his success had been the product of significant shifts, meritocratic shifts in both the city and in Britain more broadly. And so when we think about Henry and this idea that he wants to resist being the elite, there is for us a dangerous disconnect between the way that people like Henry think about themselves and what we were able to uncover when we carefully looked at patterns of elite reproduction in Britain over the last 125 years. Because in many ways, British elite hasn't changed very much at all. It was, and it continues to be, an incredibly socially exclusive formation. And this really matters, we argue, because it affects the kinds of elites that we get. Now, what you make of this will perhaps depend on your own personal political persuasion, but what's clear from our data is that elites who come from privileged backgrounds tend to tilt to the right politically and culturally. Indeed, that leaning is accentuated when people like Henry, who combine both positional power and extreme wealth, are able to blend those together. So given this, why is it that people like Henry are so keen to come across as being ordinary? Well, one answer I'm going to try and justify to you is that rising inequality, and particularly the pulling away at the very top, has created a degree of insecurity among elites about the legitimacy of their position. They're sensitive to the kinds of criticisms that may question their motives, maybe arguing that such elites are really self-serving and only self-interested. And in this context, the performance of ordinariness in maybe how you talk about your background, the way you maybe articulate your cultural taste, or the way you describe your meritocratic legitimacy is really a kind of strategic way of managing your impression in public. And as we'll go on to show, elites who can successfully convince other people that they are regular, ordinary people are seen as more sympathetic. Indeed, they're seen as more intelligent, hardworking, and even competent. And so we argue that there is a symbolic market for being ordinary. So that, in a nutshell, is the kind of basic punchline of the book. Let me kind of like take a few steps back and sort of try to explain how we got there. Because really, this project is trying to answer a relatively simple question. How has the British elite changed over the last 125 years? Is it still dominated by people born into wealth and privilege? Are those alumni of elite public schools in the UK still as likely to get into these kinds of positions as they once were? What is the kind of dynamics around gender and ethnicity and race within the British elite more broadly? How does this elite behave? What do they think? We wanted to try and answer these kinds of questions, but there is a kind of very basic and thorny issue of how you go about defining elites. This is something that many scholars have thought about in a great deal of depth. And for us, one of the challenges, as John Scott notes here, is the word elite is probably one of the most misused words in the sociological lexicon. And it doesn't get any better when you look at popular debates. In fact, popular conversation around elites has probably never been more intense. We hear, at least in the British context, criticisms of the liberal metropolitan elite, the establishment, or the super rich, sometimes maybe even the woke elite. But when we're rarely told where these formations begin and end. Even within the social sciences, there are challenges. Here is a very prominent definition from the American sociologist Shamus Khan, who argues that elites are those with disproportionate access to and control over a range of economic, cultural, social, and political resources. And for us, this kind of definition is really helpful, but it is also kind of broad. What we wanted to try and do is develop a definition of elites that's both conceptually coherent, but also temporally consistent, that retains a kind of appropriate sense of magnitude. And the way that we go about doing that is using Who's Who. So Who's Who is a very kind of British kind of publication. It's a book that lists influential and noteworthy people and has done since around 1897, at least in its current form. And it comprises a pretty tiny segment of the British population, about 0.05%, roughly around 34,000 people currently, but over time has contained just over 120,000 people. And what it primarily does is document a positional elite. These are people who are at the top, the heads of particular organizations. So they might be MPs or judges. You have members of the British Academy. You have senior lawyers, for example. And they are, this kind of idea resonates with what Moscow might have called ruling minority, elites who are empowered through their position to get into, to exercise power over others. But what's really fascinating about Who's Who is not just who it contains, but the kinds of information that it collects on these individuals. So we have information about not just the kinds of whether they have a degree or not, for example, but actually the names of specific schools and universities that they attended. We also have information on whether they're members of private members clubs. We know something about their leisure and recreational activities. But there is also this sense that Who's Who contains other kinds of people. These aren't just the heads of major organizations, because those aren't the only kinds of elites that we see within British society. So there is a proportion of this group who are selected by a board of advisors based on the reputation that these individuals have. This is often in fields where there isn't such a clear organizational hierarchy, such as the cultural arts, for example. But what is notable is that all of the individuals who end up being included in Who's Who are there and are kind of consecrated together as a group and then by virtue of being in the book. But there is, I think, for us, a question about whether even Who's Who is still maybe a little bit too big. Remember, I said that it has around 34,000 individuals, and that's still a relatively large number of individuals. So I've come back to Seamus Khan's definition here to stress something that he pulled out, which is that elites for him are those who have disproportionate control or access to and control over a range of resources. They're not just influential in perhaps one dimension. Perhaps just being really rich isn't enough by itself, for example, to be a member of the elite. And so to think about this question, we wanted to find a kind of a smaller group within the elite. The way that we've approached that in terms of defining an elite within the elite is to define a wealth elite. These are individuals who combine both positional power in that they're included in Who's Who, but also economic power because they're in the top 1% of the wealth distribution. And this kind of approach is really drawing on people like C. Wright Mills, Mosca, who I mentioned, and Pareto, and also people like Marx, who have all kind of gestured to this idea that there's something important about the confluence of both positional and economic power. And I suppose in that sense, particularly with the through lines from John Scott and C. Wright Mills, the link with Max Weber's work, I think, comes through strongly. So with this definition, this sort of wealth elite, there's around 6,000 people within that group. So still relatively large, but a much smaller proportion. Again, representing about a fifth of Who's Who, about 0.01% of the population as a whole. So how did we go about identifying this? The first way is we used probate records. So in the UK, when you die, if you leave a will, that will has to be proved, has to be formally registered with the Statistics Office, if you like. And these records have been kept publicly and consistently since about 1855. Now, they're kind of images that are online, so we had to download all of these images and use optical character recognition to sort of extract the kinds of that you can see here and make them into a database that we could then link through dates of death and names to the people in Who's Who. So that's one way we were able to get at this data. And actually just for kind of interest, on the board here is Margaret Thatcher's father. So you can see the wealth at death. He's the one at the very top. But the second thing that we did was we also, because for current members of Who's Who, they haven't died yet, so their wills haven't become publicly available. We can't find out directly. So we sent out a survey to everyone that was included in Who's Who and asked them a bunch of political and attitudinal questions, but we also asked them about their wealth. So we're able to measure the current wealth of individuals who are in Who's Who. So I've said a little bit about data and touched a bit on method, but I want to say just a bit more about how we're approaching these kinds of data resources. So for this project, what we've tried to pursue is really, I think what we would describe as longitudinal mixed methods. So I've gestured a bit to some of the large-scale quantitative data that we've collected. I've mentioned we've got Who's Who with over 125,000 people. We then, as I've said, collected all the probate records, which is around 15 million records. And then we linked that to genealogical records to the people in Who's Who so that we could find out the parents of the people who are in Who's Who and link them then to their parents' probate records, which is the reason why I had Margaret Thatcher's father on the previous slide. So we know something about the wealth that you come from, though an imperfect nature of that, of course. We have the survey we've conducted, and we also collected some other kind of random things like all of the musical tracks that are played on a radio program called Desert Island Discs, where influential and noteworthy people go on and they say, these are my favorite songs. So we just scraped all of that and downloaded it and linked it to the database that we have in Who's Who. But alongside this historical data, sorry, this quantitative data, I should say, we've also conducted a lot of qualitative interviews. Some of those are interviews we've done ourselves. I mentioned kind of nearly 150 interviews that we have done as part of the project. And I should say, when I say we, I don't mean just Sam and I, a whole bunch of brilliant and dedicated researchers were part of that, with thanks to the ERC for funding this. But we also found in the British Library an archive of interviews that had been conducted with people in Who's Who, many of whom were born right at the beginning of the 20th century. And this gives us the ability to kind of track changes over time in both the life histories and trajectories of the people that are showing up in our database. So having covered a little bit on the data methods, the kind of background for this, let me say a bit more about some of these empirical findings that I wanted to bring out. And the first thing we want to talk through, or I want to talk through, is this question of elite identity, this struggle to be ordinary that we saw that was so present in Henry's interview right at the beginning. This came out in a number of different ways in our interviews. And the first way is really kind of captured here, both by Henry, but also by Samantha on the board here, who clearly is expressing frustration at the idea that they might be considered to be part of the elite. They clearly want to reject this idea. And in some ways, I think this is really understandable. Like the term elite is often seen as a pejorative term, it's negative, people don't want to be associated with it. But there are other ways that people try to reject or push back against this idea that they're elite. And one of these is by stressing the idea that Britain has become more open, more meritocratic since the end of the 19th century. Now, they'll readily acknowledge that it's not that Britain has changed all that much over the last few decades, possibly since the kind of 1990s, but that we can't draw this kind of continuity with the Victorian age of the aristocrat, the kind of stuffy, staid kind of elite that once existed, but has now evaporated. And you can see in the quote behind me that Duncan in particular draws this kind of account out very clearly. But there are other ways that people want to claim this kind of ordinariness. And one of them is through what Sam and I call deflecting privilege. And this often shows up in quite tortured discussions of class background, where the accounts that are offered, even by very privileged people like Victoria, who actually comes, who's a celebrated professor who comes from an aristocratic background, has a kind of tortured discussion about class. It's both present, but also trying to distance yourself from it, both simultaneously. And so it's really clear that for many, discussions of class background were really quite uncomfortable. Indeed, in our survey, what we found was that around 43% of those people who said they came from a working class background had parents who actually worked in professional occupations, right? And so like Victoria, not the one on the board, the one we interviewed, many interviewees that attempted to kind of deflect from or downplay the kind of aspects of their upbringing that may have scaffolded their life trajectories and careers. And we saw that with Henry right at the beginning. This kind of awkwardness came through very clearly with one unusually frank interview with charity CEO Rachel. Throughout her career, Rachel had gone to some lengths to hide the fact that she had gone to an elite private school when she was a child, and had actually omitted it from her Who's Who biography. So it wasn't something that we knew when we went to interview her. And so when you put these kind of three different aspects together, there's a sense that instinctively people want to kind of distance themselves from the privilege they may have had. They want to tell an upward story, a story of meritocratic striving, that I kind of made it into these positions against the odds. And this is something that we just do not see when we look at the interviews from the beginning of the 20th century, right? And this is just one example. Jeremy Morse, this isn't anonymized. All the other ones are, we've used pseudonyms for them, but Jeremy Morse is, anyone could find this quote if they went into the British Library archive, so it's not anonymized. But what you can see, I think, in Jeremy's account is this sense of actual, relatively kind of easy sense in which they're talking about the advantages that they got from their family. And this comes through in a variety of the interviews. So why do we care about expressions of ordinariness sociologically? The first big reason is that they contradict what we find when we look at the empirical quantitative data. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And what we see at a very high level is that the propulsive power of being born into wealth, of having gone to elite public schools and Oxbridge, so in large respects, hasn't really changed that much at all. There's a remarkable degree of continuity in those kinds of processes and institutions. So let's try and dig into that in a little bit more detail together. The first kind of big question that we wanted to unpack was this: are elite narratives of opening up correct? And the way that we went about doing this, and I've sort of touched on this a moment, but I'm going to just to connect this clearly. The way that we did this was we tracked down the wealth and debt of the parents of the people in whose home. And what we then wanted to do is see kind of over time whether there was change in the proportion of people that are getting into these elite positions that come from wealthy backgrounds. And what we find is in the graph here. And there are really two big things, I think, to draw away from this figure. The first is that being born into wealth gives you an advantage. You are overrepresented in the elite if you come from wealthy backgrounds, including the top 10% and the top 1%. But we also see a kind of relatively high degree of stability. There is change in the top 10%, a bit more, and it certainly seems to rebound a bit, but there's much more stability when you look at the top 1% in particular. And this is remarkable because of this graph, which isn't our work, it's Alvarado, Atkinson, and Morelli, who look at the share of total wealth captured by the top 1% in Britain over time. And what this figure shows to us is that there has been a remarkable degree of equalization within the distribution of wealth in Britain throughout the 20th century. And there's a variety of reasons for this playing out. Similar graphs, can be shown from like Piketty's work in particular. Much of this seems to be linked with kind of the rise of home ownership in particular. But what this graph suggests to us is that the affluent families have retained the ability to propel their kids into these elite positions, despite becoming relatively less wealthy compared to other people in Britain. Indeed, going back to this figure, what we see is that if you were born into the top 1%, you've pretty consistently been 20 times more likely to get into one of these elite positions than other people in the British population. So for us, at least, it's clear that elite origins seem to matter. But what about attending one of these kind of prestigious public schools, as they're called in the UK? Has the proportion of those people who are reaching elite positions changed over time? And in particular, in this part of the analysis, we're going to focus on 9 schools. These are called the Clarendon schools because of a commission in the middle of the Victorian era. Now, these are schools that you probably have heard of. They're places like Eton and Harrow, Westminster, Winchester, and Rugby. They're prominent because many of our British politicians come from these schools. Indeed, a ridiculously large proportion of our prime ministers have attended Eton alone. So we focus on those. And when we look at the proportion of people in who's who that have attended these schools, you can see a couple of storylines. The black line at the bottom here is those 9 Clarendon schools. So the first thing to take away is just, they're ridiculously likely to end up in these kinds of positions. But there has been some change over time. So at the kind of end of the Victorian period, about 20% of the people in who's who were born in those cohorts had gone to one of these 9 Clarendon schools, and that's dropped to about 8–9% among the most recent cohorts. We've got these other categories of private and schools in general. The HMC schools here are smaller, or a small group of elite public schools, around 200 schools in that category. So again, very high likelihood of getting into these positions having attended one of these schools. But it's also, I think, important not to overemphasize that decline. It doesn't, at least to us, seem to be a kind of terminal decay in the power of these institutions. That actually, yes, they've come down somewhat, but if you look in this figure at the proportion of people who attended these schools among recent entrants to who's who, it seems to have stabilized somewhat. It's not kind of continually going down And just to put this in context, if you had gone to one of these private Clarendon schools, even today, you're still 52 times more likely to have ended up in these elite positions than people who attended any other school in Britain. But what about girls' schools? Because the Clarendon schools, indeed most of the schools that I've talked about, were historically all boys' schools. But within Britain, there has been, for a long time, a thriving ecosystem of girls' schools. And in this figure, we're trying to sort of unpack what's happening across these two different types of schools. So the Clarendon schools on the boys' side, and then we've also capped, there isn't a kind of a categorization, a name that we can use. So we've just called them the top girls' schools, but a similarly sized group of schools. But the alumni of those schools, compared to other women, never reached the same kind of level that the men do. These schools have just not been as powerful relative to their own gender than as the boys' schools. And there's a variety of historical reasons that I can unpack if we're interested in the Q&A. The third thing that we want to unpack is the role of Oxford and Cambridge. And I have a particular connection to that, having worked at Oxford for a number of years and for much of the time that I was working on this book. And I think when you talk to people in the UK about the power of Oxford and Cambridge, there's an assumption that not much has changed. But I think that assumption is really rooted to a large extent in, well, it's really guesswork, it's conjecture, because there isn't really a lot of good data to sort of unpack that. And who's who does give us a lens on that question. So in this figure, what you can see is the proportion of people in who's who that have attended different kinds of universities. So the middle line, which I think is blue, the middle blue line is Oxford and Cambridge. The top black line is kind of everyone having reported going to any university. So you can see a kind of rise in the number of graduates, and you can see the Russell group is a group of kind of research-intensive universities. You might think of it as being like equivalent to like R1 universities in the US. And you have some that are based in London and some that are not. We sort of pass those out a bit here. But I think the really important thing to pull out is that when you look at the Oxford and Cambridge line, it's relatively flat. It's bounced basically between 30 and 40% pretty consistently over this period. But what this figure misses, I think, is the kind of really dramatic change in access to higher education over this period. So at the very beginning of this period, if you went to Oxford and Cambridge, you were basically all of the people that went to university. Whereas by the end of this period, you were like less than 1%, or maybe around 1% of the students. So what happens to this kind of graph when we put that in the context of like the changes in higher education? Well, this is what we see. Now, these lines are the likelihood of getting into who's who again, having attended particular kinds of universities compared to people that never went to university. And I want you just to focus on the top blue line here, which is Oxford and Cambridge again. And here what we see is not a completely smooth story. That actually up to the end of the 19th century, there was a really remarkable degree, remarkable connection between attending one of those two universities and getting into these elite positions. But that did come down through the early part of the 20th century before experiencing a degree of resurgence, particularly as you move into the kind of post Second World War era. So in particular, if we think about this, these kind of cohorts that were benefiting from this are the people who are kind of running the country today. These are individuals who became more likely to get into these positions because they went to Oxford and Cambridge. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that there's been no change within the elite at all. And when we think about the proportion of new entrants to who's who that are women, there has been some significant movement. So at the end of the 1980s, for example, it was maybe around 7 to 8% of new entrants were women. That's risen to around 27, 28% of new entrants. Now, in my personal view, this has still not gone anywhere near far enough, but there has been some change over time here. Though notably, much less change for women of color over the same period. In addition, when we look at race and ethnicity, it seems there has been some movement in the most recent decades, particularly among Asian elites. But what I also want to draw your attention to in this figure is the fact that elites from Asian or Black backgrounds are pretty consistently present all the way through the British elite here. And this is to do with the role of empire in Britain. So going back, you could be in the British elite if you were the head of the Indian civil service, for example. These kinds of positions played a role. And as Britain withdrew from those kind of colonies, the who's who kind of reconfigured to some extent the people that get included, but also then this was mirrored by other processes of migration that brought in new groups of individuals into the British elite through other mechanisms. So although the elite has changed in some respects, for us, the kind of maybe big story here is a sense of persistence that plays out. That and I think this degree of persistence in elite reproduction should really raise questions for us about what this performance of ordinariness really means. Like if elite narratives of opening up, of meritocratic legitimacy are somewhat of an illusion, why is it that elites are so keen to present themselves as being ordinary? And as I suggested right at the beginning, our argument is that there is a distinct market for being ordinary. And to explain one of the ways that this plays out, we want to turn to the public performance of our cultural selves. And as I mentioned, Who's Who has a really unique lens on this, in part because it has access to data on leisure activities and recreations. So just to give you a sense of this data, you can see this figure. So I've got two lines here. There's more that we could pull out, but just for simplicity, focusing on two. The red line is the proportion of people over time in Who's Who, when asked about their leisure and recreation activities, only list what we would call highbrow tastes. These are things like going to the opera, the theatre, or listening to classical music. Now, what's striking is that that kind of peaks around cohorts that turn 20 in the 1940s and 1950s before it starts to decline. And then what seems to rise is things that we describe as popular or everyday pastimes. So this could be things like spending time with family, walking the dog, maybe even going to watch football, for example. So these two things start to cross each other. Now, one way of reading this is that you could see it as the decline of highbrow culture among the elite and the rise of kind of more popular and everyday tastes. But actually, when you look at the combination of activities, the story is a little bit more complex. So here what we've got is three lines now. At the beginning, we can see the dominance of what we call the kind of aristocratic mode of cultural distinction among the elite. So these are activities associated with landed estates, hunting and shooting, for example. Now, these wane fairly spectacularly towards the beginning of the 20th century, and what seems to replace it is the rise of this highbrow orientation that I've talked about before. So in the middle of the 20th century, elites really were saying things like going to the opera, the theatre, and listening to classical music. But then what happens, and this is the third line, is not that people reject those highbrow tastes entirely, but what they start to do is blend them with these more popular and ordinary tastes. So now they say, I go to the theatre, I go to the opera, and I spend time with my wife. Yeah, which is good for them, right? But one of the things that comes out, and we could still read this as a kind of the rise of a kind of cultural egalitarianism, but we don't see it quite that way. And one of the things is that what comes through in a number of the interviews that we've conducted is a kind of residual highbrow orientation, perhaps even a degree of snobbishness that's sometimes carefully veiled within the context of the interview. And so what I've got on the slide here, suitably anonymized, is what someone has written in their Who's Who profile about their cultural tastes, which is running, visiting old churches and shouting answers to TV quiz shows. And then what they told us about their tastes in the kind of privacy and of an anonymous interview, where it becomes really clear that highbrow forms of culture are incredibly important to both who they are and their sense of self. So these findings, at least in our view, leave us with two kind of linked important questions. One, why do these people struggle so hard to come across as being ordinary in terms of background, but also in terms of taste? And second, why did this performance of ordinariness seem to have kind of become so salient in recent decades? And our answer is that successful expressions of ordinariness represent a distinct cultural currency. And the way that we try to unpack this is through two experiments. The first we did with members of the general population. So we asked them to read, we did a few of these, I'm showing you just one, but we asked them to read a series of simple vignettes. In vignette one, they meet an academic who comes, well, they don't meet, they see them on TV, but they're introduced, I should say, to an academic who comes from a working class background. And in vignette two, they're introduced to an academic via the television who comes from a middle class background. And then we ask them to rate these individuals on a bunch of different dimensions, these hypothetical individuals. And what we find is really clear, is that across each of the questions, the middle class academic is not viewed as positively as the working class academic. As I kind of said right at the beginning, the middle class academic is seen as less intelligent, less hardworking. The research that they do is less useful to people in society. They're less likely to be competent at their job. And I think also really strikingly, much less likely to listen carefully to someone like them. Okay? Now, this pattern played out in each of the cases that we ran. We ran one with a judge, with a CEO, the same kinds of patterns show up. So what this shows, I should say, before I kind of move on, is that we think there's sort of a wide symbolic market for being ordinary. The sense that the British public, at least, resonate with and respond to elites who come from what they see as humble backgrounds or have more ordinary cultural tastes. So then we wanted to answer the second question of why has this shift happened? And again, we did another experiment here. This time, this experiment was ran with elites in who's who. And what we wanted them to do, and I mentioned this briefly before, but we had a radio show in Britain called Desert Island Discs. And the premise of that show, as I mentioned, is that you go on the radio show and you have to pick your favorite tracks that you would take to a desert island and that you would listen to only those pieces of music until the day you die. You also get to pick a book that you would take with you. This is the kind of premise of the show. So we asked the people that we were surveying to imagine they were going on the show and they had to pick one track and one book that they would take with them. And then we also wanted them to give us the reasons that they would pick that book and that track. But for half of them, before they answered that question, they answered this question on the slide, which is really trying to prime the salience of rising inequality and to recognize, we wanted them to recognize that people like them have probably been the beneficiaries of that rising inequality. And what we're interested in seeing here is whether their responses to the desert island disc question change on average, given that they first were primed with this sense of rising inequality. And what we see here is not dramatic, but relatively clear, that people that read that inequality or answered that inequality question gave different kinds of answers. They reduced the prevalence with which they said that the piece of music they would take was a kind of classical piece of music. They reduced the kind of books or changed the kind of books that they would talk about. They no longer said things like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, right? Kind of serious, highbrow books. But they also even changed the reasons they gave for why they picked the pieces of music that they did. They started to use more nostalgic reasons rather than aesthetic ones. So rather than commenting on the quality of the piece of music that they picked, they would say, this reminds me of when I was courting my wife, for example. So given all of this, why does it matter who gets into the elite, right? We spent a lot of time kind of unpacking this question, and we want to try and get to the point where we think there's a payoff. And what we've got on the slide here is the current Labour Party cabinet for Britain. And ostensibly, it's important because this is the most working class and state educated cabinet in British history, at least. But does this matter? Well, what we find, again from our survey data, is that elites who come from privileged backgrounds tend to be more right-leaning than those who come from less advantaged backgrounds. We also find that women also lean to the left within the elite. And here in particular is where we see it's really important to distinguish between elites as a group and particularly this kind of subgroup, the wealth elite, because wealth elites in particular are even more right-leaning in terms of their orientation to a wide variety of political questions, which I can talk about in more detail if we want to. So I'm coming to the end now. It's getting warm in here, and I'm sure you're itching to ask questions. But There are obviously a wide variety of limitations to this, and I think we're not unaware of those, and I won't spend time talking through them now because I'm sure you will have all picked them up and want to ask me questions about them in a bit, but we also want to gesture to the fact that we're aware of many of those, I think. So let me just kind of zoom out and try to finish with some high-level reflections about why we think this matters. What are the kind of implications, perhaps, in terms of policy? For us, the basic message that emerges from this work is that contemporary British elite is increasingly wants to present itself as ordinary, as regular, as everyday. And they want to do that against the kind of caricatured notion of the British elite in the past, kind of stuffy, closed, highly exclusive elite that operated at the end of the 19th century. But for us, that performance of ordinariness shores up the legitimacy of that elite because the public are more sympathetic to elites who come across as being down to earth and everyday kind of individual. And for us, we think this is one of the unique contributions of the work that we've done. Now, to be clear, we recognize that many others have documented this kind of orientation towards ordinariness in elites in other settings, so like Richard Sherman in the US and Hanna Kusula in Norway. But what we're able to document here, I think, is why that's playing out. To uncover the symbolic market for ordinariness that elites are also operating within. And for us, this process is pernicious, in part because it strongly contradicts the empirical reality that we're able to see. There has not been significant change, for example, in the relationship between being born into wealth and getting into these positions. So despite what elites in Britain may tell everyone, that Britain really hasn't changed all that much. But that stereotype of a snobbish, socially exclusive formation still, to some extent, for us at least, largely holds. And this not only underlines entrenched inequalities, but also, for us at least, influences the kind of politics that we get. And as I mentioned before, how you read this will definitely depend on your kind of political prior. But I think it, for us, leads to our second contribution, which is that there has been a lot of work in kind of elite studies more broadly about who elites are. And what we're trying to do, I hope, so maybe not totally successfully, is make this leap from who they are to what they think, and even to some extent, what they do. So if elite reproduction has been stable, and this affects the kinds of politics that we get, what could we do to alter processes of elite reproduction? Now, sociologists are not necessarily well known for coming up with like viable policy solutions, but we gave it a crack anyway. And so what I'm going to lay out for you is a few reflections that we had on things you could try to do if you wanted to really try and remake this process. And the first is you could try to implement an annual wealth tax. If you really wanted to try and break the link between wealth and elite reproduction, it seems to us at least that you need to proactively try to reduce the gap between the top and the bottom, not just lift up the bottom, which is what has happened in terms of access to wealth in Britain over the last 100 years. If you wanted to undermine the power of elite schools, one way we could do that is restrict the number of privately educated students at Russell Group universities, those research-intensive universities, to 10%. Why 10%? Because 10% of sixth form students, the students that are still in school at 16 to 18, have attended a private school. So basically, it would match the proportion in the British population. And then finally, if we think we need to reform admissions to Oxford and Cambridge, because to us it seems a bit absurd that the elite who are going to be in charge 30 years from now are being determined by interviews with Oxford and Cambridge academics. And so to us, we would eradicate applications and randomly recruit students above an attainment threshold. And the reason that we would do this is because at the moment, only 12% of those students who get top grades in the northeast of the country are applying to Oxford and Cambridge. In London and the southeast, that's around 40%. The bright kids who could get into these schools are just not applying. And doing this would kind of solve that problem. So these reforms, intentionally provocative though they are intended to kind of meaningfully remake the channels of elite recruitment. And this effort brings me back to the beginning, brings me back, Henry, Because our key argument is that when people like Henry perform ordinariness, when they downplay their economic power and they deflect privilege, they are, intentionally or not, obscuring the very real differences in wealth and opportunity, power and influence between themselves and everyone else. Thank you very much.